Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Simo. I head up BetBuddy. BetBuddy is part of a company called Playtech. So what we do at BetBuddy is we use data to help the gambling industry understand behavior and detect at-risk behaviors. And Playtech is I guess it's the largest supplier of software and services to the online gambling industry. So the kinds of products and services we develop, things like poker networks, bingo networks, slot machines, and casino games, sports betting, virtual games, etc. So what I want to talk about today is three things. I want to give you a bit of an intro to the gambling industry. I want to talk to you about the work we're doing to use machine learning to try and understand at-risk behavior and prevent harm. And then I want to talk a little bit more broadly around not just sort of the learning aspects of AI, but what other elements of intelligence may we need to fully get the benefits of AI going forward. So things like explainability, judgment, ethics, and so forth. Okay, so just a bit of background to the gambling industry. So the industry globally is worth about 400 billion plus euros. Just for some context, it's about a quarter of the size of the automotive industry, probably about a third of the size of the alcohol industry, 3 times as big as the video gaming industry, predominantly split between lottery products, sports betting, and casino. About 11 or 12% of the gambling industry is consumed online. It's a growing sector in many jurisdictions. Interestingly, you can see there only about half of it is what we call onshore or through regulated online gambling. And we estimate here at Playtech there's probably over 1 billion people in the world who like to gamble and place a bet. And the vast majority of people do this in a manner that's entertainment. They don't suffer harms from gambling. But in some markets, gambling is facing a moment of crisis. And as with all industries, they all have their negative externalities. Gambling is problem gambling, and the harm suffered to individuals, their families, friends, and communities, and the wider society. And if we look at just the two largest jurisdictions in Europe, the UK and Italy, gambling is facing a backlash from politicians, from regulators, and from the wider public. If we take the UK, for example, when online gambling was liberated and regulated in 2007, and we had the expansion of gambling on the high street, what we've seen really is a saturation, for example, of gambling advertising across all media. And this has caused a backlash. And I could provide you many, many examples of negative press around gambling in the UK. And in Italy, for example, the government has banned all forms of advertising, complete ban. You cannot advertise the product. And arguably, this very drastic and draconian measure is not actually going to help the people it's designed to help, which are the problem gamblers. And in the UK, again, recently, only a couple of weeks ago, a very influential group of MPs, cross-party MPs, called for a limit to online stakes. Again, quite a drastic measure, you'd think, and could drive a lot of people who are at risk of gambling-related harm to those more unscrupulous offshore sites that are not regulated. So the question is, can AI help the gambling industry to solve this crisis? And before I try and answer that, I wanted to quote from a book that I very recently read. It's called The Promise of Artificial Intelligence. And it's a good book. It gives a little bit of background to the history, the 60s, good old-fashioned AI, the symbolic and logic approaches to AI, the 90s, the second wave of AI around neural nets, and then asks the question, when is this third wave going to happen? Will it ever happen? And it talks about, and this is what a lot of people term artificial general intelligence. And the crux of the argument in the book is around these two concepts of reckoning, which is another term for automation, and judgment. And I just want to quote from the book. So I use the term judgment for the ideal to which I argue we should hold full-blooded human intelligence, a form of dispassionate, deliberative thought, grounded in ethical commitment and responsible action, appropriate to the situation in which it's deployed. Judgment is the standard to which human thinking must ultimately aspire. And I use the term reckoning for the types of calculative prowess at which computer and AI systems excel. Skills of extraordinary utility and importance on which there is every reason to suppose computers will continue to advance. But skills embodied in devices that lack the ethical commitments, the deep contextual awareness and judgment, which the author argues to be profound. And I think this raises a number of questions around sort of what intelligence is and what types of intelligence we want or are comfortable with AI making today. So for example, would you be comfortable sitting in an autonomous vehicle driving through London today in the dark and the rain and all the traffic? Probably not. But would you be comfortable with an interstate truck driving across the US, across a single highway with not much traffic? You'd probably be much more comfortable with that. So when it comes to whether, can AI solve these sensitive areas that require human judgment, I think we'll stall unless we can begin to trust the AIs that are supporting that decision making or making those decisions. Okay, about 4 years ago, a colleague of mine was presenting at a conference to gambling regulators, operators, treatment providers, researchers, and he posed a question to the audience. He said, if you had a choice of having an algorithm that can detect gambling-related harm, one which was 90% accurate, but you didn't understand how it made its decision, and one which is 75% accurate, but you fully understood how it made its decision, which would you take? And I was surprised that virtually everybody, about 90%, went for the latter. They went for the algorithm that was less accurate, the more accurate one. And you think about the goal of what the algorithm's trying to do, I was surprised at that. But we came across a lot of pushback when we were building our solutions a few years ago from regulators and operators who were uncomfortable with the concept of machines or black boxes making decisions in these sensitive areas. And of course, when you think about it as well, let's take autonomous vehicles again. Most people would probably admit that an AI will probably drive more consistently and safer and make less mistakes and have less accidents and fatalities than humans. But the very idea that a machine could kill a human, regardless of that, makes us uncomfortable, especially if we don't know what led to that decision. So the problem we had with sort of machine learning was this idea that we couldn't verify the properties of the software. So if you take any other software that we use in the gambling industry, let's take the back office software, account opening process, let's take payments, you can design and test that. Even if you look at the slots that we develop, we can simulate those slots over billions of spins very quickly, and we can guarantee the fairness in how they pay out. But when it comes to machine learning, we can't actually verify the properties of this software because it isn't a human who's actually coded it and those many thousands of non-linear connections that are in the model. It's actually decided by the data. And this caused us problems. And really the solution to this was to was to think about the ability to rely on the machine and the machine learning to make the decision, but have a layer of software that could interpret how it makes its decisions. So you could begin to, for example, debug things like false positives and false negatives. And it's this area in the green box that I want to focus on for the rest of the presentation. So not the process of training and learning, but some of these other areas of intelligence. So what I'm going to show you now is how the BetBuddy software works. So here's a picture of a risk profile of a player. Typically, machine learning gives you a single output, let's say a value between 0 and 1, and you have a threshold, and it will predict or classify. And these models can be very complex. They could have 50 or 60 input variables, many of them highly engineered sometimes. But for example, this player is only engaged in 2 games. We know that some people who are engaged in many games are at risk of harm. We can also look at this player and see that they're only using 1 payment method. We know when players are using 3 or 4, they're sometimes struggling to fund their accounts. This particular player doesn't change their deposit limits. They have no declined deposits. But as we go further up, we'll see there are some things that are driving and explaining the prediction, for example, losses and deposit increases. So casual players will typically deposit and play in a very consistent manner. They may not really increase their deposits more than once or twice. This particular player has done it a number of times in the last 3 months. So what we can begin to do is offer the benefits of machine learning, but also a software that can support the person who uses it in understanding how the decision is made. We can also get experts, we can get regulators, we can get researchers, we can get clinicians to come in and actually validate that the models that we're deploying in these sensitive areas are working as they should be. And most importantly, when they make decisions that are incorrect, we can understand why they're making those decisions and go back to the training process and improve them. Now, we were forced to look at this because regulators and industry were uncomfortable with machine learning making these decisions without some form of explainability and transparency. But having solved that problem, actually, what we didn't realize we were doing was creating an opportunity to do something else and solve another problem. So in the UK, the gambling industry is actually compelled to assess players' behavior, assess early signs of risk, and actually communicate to players and interact with them on a regular basis, and also assess whether those interactions are actually having any impact on their behavior or not. And by building these very detailed knowledge graphs and breakdowns of players and these explanations, what we could do now through APIs, and we know that APIs have fueled the massive adoption of machine learning, we can begin to start driving very targeted messages. So for example, this player who's increasing their deposit limits, we can make it more frictionless for them to access the deposit limit setting functionality. We can even suggest a sensible limit based on the data. Also, because every player is different, there could be a player who's at risk of gambling-related harm. It could be that their session times are increasing, and we could again try and intervene and break up their play. And in this particular example, what we're doing is trying to use nudge principles. We're not telling them that we think they're problematic. We know through research and our own efforts that that doesn't work. We're trying to break it up with another incentive. And likewise, we can do any number of customer journeys based on players' risk profiles and how they behave. In this particular example, we can even ask the player if they are having fun, if they're enjoying their gambling. If they're not, we can send them down a certain pathway. And this, we believe, can help not only achieve the regulatory requirements of understanding how people play and interacting with them, but it can make the interactions more relevant and actually potentially improve the customer experience. So, to summarize, okay, for the last decade, most of the effort has been on building applications and services. And, as the previous speakers have said, AI is becoming ever more pervasive in all the industries and devices that we use. But I believe that in the next decade, there will be a shift in focus away from building and more around ethics, explainability, and evaluation. Notwithstanding, the big tech companies will absolutely continue to keep investing billions of dollars in trying to get to that panacea of artificial general intelligence, but I don't believe we'll get there in the next decade. So what we should be doing is trying to get the best and more out of what we've built today. We did have a workshop a few years ago, but I just want to talk about some of the principles that I think we should all be adopting going forward. This is really only a subset of what we believe we should be doing. So building AI to enhance staff capability and skills, so human-centric approaches to AI rather than AI as a means to itself, being scientifically robust, continuing to evaluate, and being open about blind spots, so not blindly putting our trust in AI. There will be these inevitable failures of AI for sure, unless we try very hard to understand how they work and how those decisions work and where those blind spots are, we won't be able to improve them going forward. So unless we take this approach, I don't believe we will have the opportunity to fully reap the benefits of AI and all of the applications that it's going to be deployed in today and going forwards. Thank you.